Gene Watson is sitting next to an empty chair over there, and we have fun and we laugh and we cut up, and we had something kind of serious happen earlier in the day today.
Well, I've always, loved Mark. He's from right down the road where I am and everything, and I've always loved his music. And, of course, when I was diagnosed with cancer,
It began with a fragment of evidence that no one expected to resurface. For decades, the Gene Watson mystery had been a cold, impenetrable enigma, an unsolved puzzle that drew the fascination of amateur sleuths, seasoned investigators, and the public alike. His disappearance, the strange trail of contradictory leads, and the unsettling clues left behind formed a narrative that seemed almost designed to resist resolution. Every attempt to piece the story together ended with more questions than answers, and the case was filed away in the collective memory as one of those unsolvable knots in history. That changed abruptly when a single overlooked item, buried deep in an evidence locker, forced the entire investigation into a new, startling light. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The recovered item was mundane at first glance, but forensic advances transformed it into a decisive breakthrough. Analysts who had pored over the case in the early years had dismissed it as irrelevant, an ordinary possession that could not meaningfully connect to the timeline of Watson's last known movements. But the technology of today offered a precision unavailable in the past. When it was re-examined, subtle traces, almost ghost-like in their presence, revealed a pattern that had been invisible for decades. Within that pattern lay the hidden connection between Watson's final hours and a network of events no one had ever linked together. Once the pattern was recognized, it was as if the case unfolded in a sudden cascade. Details that had long been treated as dead ends aligned into a coherent chain of causality. Investigators realized that Watson had not simply vanished in a fit of randomness or personal choice. His disappearance was an orchestrated act embedded within a broader operation. The shocking part was the identity of those involved. Not an anonymous figure in the shadows, but individuals whose lives had intersected with Watson in seemingly benign ways. This was not the result of chance, but of a deliberate, meticulous plan that had been hiding in plain sight. The discovery forced a reevaluation of every piece of physical evidence and every eyewitness statement ever recorded in the file. Scenes once believed to be irrelevant background moments were suddenly central to understanding motive and execution. A seemingly casual conversation overheard in a diner, a suspicious delay in a phone call, a receipt that bore the wrong timestamp, all were now part of a deliberate architecture designed to control the narrative of Watson's fate. What made the revelation so jarring was how it exposed the fragility of perceived reality in criminal investigations. The Watson case had been used in law enforcement training courses as an example of chaotic disappearance, where coincidence and incomplete data form an impenetrable fog. In truth, the fog had been manufactured. The actors behind it had been careful enough to leave investigators chasing loops of false logic, planting enough convincing distractions to ensure that no single lead could be followed to its true origin. This level of orchestration suggested expertise far beyond an ordinary criminal mind. The role of technology in the breakthrough could not be overstated. Forensic tools capable of detecting micro-residues, reconstructing fragmented digital data, and correlating historical records in milliseconds had turned an inert case file into a living map of movements and interactions. The reanalysis didn't just point to a culprit. It illuminated the psychology of the deception itself. Every move made by those behind Watson's disappearance had been calculated to exploit the limitations of the time period, knowing that physical and digital blind spots would conceal their work. As the revelations deepened, the story of Gene Watson's last days emerged with harrowing clarity. The newly uncovered chain of events began days before the night he vanished, marked by a series of subtle manipulations. Appointments were rescheduled, travel routes altered, and personal communications quietly intercepted. Watson's own behavior in those days, previously interpreted as erratic or distressed, now appeared to be the measured responses of someone dimly aware that he was being steered toward an unknown outcome. He had tried to alter his routines, to break free of a pattern he sensed was dangerous, but his attempts were systematically countered. Perhaps the most chilling detail was how close the original investigation had come to stumbling upon the truth. At least twice in the early months, investigators had paths before them that, if pursued, might have exposed the operation in full. But the same calculated interference that ensnared Watson also reached the investigation itself. Key witnesses withdrew cooperation at critical moments. Evidence was misplaced or mislabeled just long enough for its relevance to decay. False confessions and misleading tips clogged the system, consuming time and resources until the window of opportunity closed. This revelation has cast an enduring shadow over the case's legacy. The idea that such a complete and convincing illusion could be sustained for so long challenges assumptions about the resilience of truth. It raises unsettling questions about how many other unsolvable mysteries may be unsolvable, not because the answers are unknowable, but because they are actively hidden by skillful manipulation. The Watson case has now become a textbook example of how concealment can be just as intricate and intentional as the crime itself. The nature of the individuals behind the operation was equally startling. They were not the stereotypical figures associated with abduction or conspiracy. Instead, they blended seamlessly into everyday roles: colleagues, acquaintances, and peripheral members of social circles. They possessed the rare ability to exert influence without arousing suspicion, crafting a version of events so coherent and ordinary that no one questioned it. Their strength lay in knowing exactly which details to leave untouched, so the larger illusion would hold. For those who had followed the case for years, the emotional impact of the breakthrough was profound. The Gene Watson mystery had been an open wound in the world of true crime, a tantalizing, frustrating narrative where every promising lead collapsed under scrutiny. The unmasking of its hidden architecture brought both satisfaction and discomfort. Satisfaction in seeing the pieces finally fit, discomfort in realizing how close everyone had been to accepting a false version of history as fact. This case also serves as a stark reminder of the evolving nature of investigation. What seemed unknowable in one era can become clear in another, not through luck, but through relentless re-examination with better tools and sharper perspectives. It underscores the necessity of preserving even the smallest scraps of evidence, no matter how irrelevant they may seem at the time. In the Watson case, that single overlooked item was the pivot on which the entire truth turned. Without it, the narrative would have remained frozen in its old, misleading form. The implications ripple far beyond the specifics of Watson's fate. It challenges the public to reconsider the permanence of official conclusions, especially in cases where the absence of resolution is taken as proof of randomness or futility. It emphasizes the responsibility of investigators to question not only the answers they find, but the questions they are led to ask in the first place. The Watson operation succeeded for decades because it controlled both the information available and the framework in which that information was interpreted. For the law enforcement community, the case will now likely become a foundational study in manipulation detection. It will influence training on recognizing the fingerprints of deliberate misdirection, not just in high-profile disappearances, but in fraud, espionage, and cybercrime. The lesson is simple but daunting. The more polished and coherent a false narrative appears, the more aggressively it should be tested. The Watson mystery, in its new light, also reveals something unsettling about human perception. We are wired to prefer a tidy, closed narrative, even if it leaves some loose ends. In the absence of a clear resolution, the mind fills the gaps with patterns that feel logical. This psychological tendency made the case's misdirection so effective. It allowed the architects of Watson's disappearance to let the public imagination do part of their work for them. Every false lead seemed plausible because it aligned with a story that already felt true. Shocking picture that has emerged is not one of chaos, but of precision. Gene Watson's vanishing was not a sudden, unplanned act, but the culmination of a carefully staged sequence. Every element, from the physical setting to the flow of information, was arranged to create a controlled disappearance that would stand up to scrutiny for decades. In many ways, it was less a crime of opportunity than a performance, with Watson as the unwilling central figure in a script written by others. Now that the truth is out, the magnitude of that performance is clearer than ever. It speaks to a level of patience and discipline rarely seen in criminal undertakings. The architects behind it had no interest in immediate gain. Their objective required years of quiet, careful positioning. the maintenance of outward normalcy, and the suppression of suspicion at every turn. This was not merely about removing Watson from the picture, it was about ensuring that the picture itself would never be accurately redrawn. Even in the absence of aftermath details, the breakthrough stands as one of the most remarkable in modern investigative history. It bridges the gap between an era when the limits of technology allowed deception to thrive and the present, where those same advances can resurrect truth from the smallest of traces. For those who have long studied the case, the resolution offers not only closure but a sobering appreciation for the complexity of human design, both in creating elaborate illusions and in dismantling them. The days preceding Gene Watson's disappearance now read like the opening acts of a meticulously crafted drama. What once looked like disconnected moments, innocuous to the casual observer, were in fact deliberate signals, shifts, and setups. Each day brought another calculated nudge that positioned Watson exactly where his unseen manipulators wanted him. These moments were not simply opportunistic, but carefully synchronized, taking into account his routines, his relationships, and even his personal quirks. It began subtly. A change in his work schedule was arranged under the guise of an administrative error, pulling him away from familiar environments and placing him in locations where he was more vulnerable to surveillance. At the same time, minor inconveniences crept into his life. An unexpected car repair, a delayed bank transaction, a lost piece of mail. On their own, these seemed like the normal static of daily life. But together, they served to disrupt his natural rhythm and make him more susceptible to further manipulation. The people behind the operation knew the power of disorientation, of chipping away at a target's sense of control until they were unknowingly guided along a path. As these disruptions accumulated, certain interactions took on greater significance. A brief conversation with a coworker became the catalyst for a rescheduled meeting. That meeting in turn led Watson to travel a route he rarely took, one that passed close to a seemingly irrelevant location, a cafe where one of the key players in the conspiracy could observe him without being noticed. These cascading cause and effect moments were so artfully arranged that they left no overt trace of coordination, yet in hindsight, they form a perfect chain. There were also signs of strategic isolation. Friends who might have acted as stabilizing influences in Watson's life were drawn away, either by subtle persuasion or through small conflicts that seemed organic but were engineered. The result was a shrinking circle of trust, leaving Watson with fewer anchors to reality and fewer people to question the oddities piling up around him. Every conversation, every altered plan chipped away at the structures that might have alerted him to the danger. By the time Watson realized he was being maneuvered, the net was already closing. Evidence now shows that he attempted small acts of resistance, changing his travel times, ignoring certain instructions, and avoiding specific places. But these gestures were anticipated. When he tried to create distance, the response was immediate and calculated. Another coincidence, another carefully staged encounter, or another sudden obligation to redirect his attention. The timing was too precise to be accidental. His life was being curated in real time, every movement predicted and accounted for. The night of his disappearance was the inevitable conclusion of these machinations. It was not an abrupt abduction from the shadows, as some had theorized, but a carefully arranged event in which Watson was led to believe he was acting on his own decisions. The route he took that evening, one that appeared random in the original investigation, was in fact the result of a sequence of manipulated choices. A subtle shift in traffic patterns, an urgent message, and a false deadline combined to funnel him into the exact location where the final stage could be enacted without witnesses. One of the most astonishing elements uncovered in the recent investigation is how the environment itself was prepared in advance. Streetlights in certain areas were deliberately left unrepaired, creating pockets of darkness. Security cameras along key streets were either malfunctioning or temporarily offline, an occurrence that at the time was attributed to routine technical issues. Locations that might have provided visibility or drawn attention to the operation were subtly cleared. Shops closed earlier than usual. Pedestrians diverted by unrelated events. This was more than planning. It was orchestration on a level that required both patience and influence. Understanding the psychological engineering behind the operation is just as critical as tracing its logistics. Those behind it demonstrated an acute awareness of human behavior, particularly Watson's. They knew his habits, his likely reactions to stress, and the ways in which he processed information. More disturbingly, they exploited his empathy and sense of responsibility. Many of the staged events played on his instinct to help, to resolve small crises, or to fulfill obligations. In this way, his own virtues became the levers used to move him toward the final moment. This manipulation was not confined to Watson alone. The people around him, colleagues, acquaintances, and even strangers, were unknowingly woven into the narrative. An offhand remark by a barista, a question from a neighbor, or a sudden request from a distant contact, all were scripted elements delivered through individuals who had no idea they were participating. The architects of the disappearance understood that the most convincing messengers are those who believe entirely in the authenticity of their role. The new findings also reveal that this was not the work of a large, faceless organization, as some had speculated, but rather a small, tightly coordinated group. Their advantage was not in numbers, but in precision. With only a handful of actors, each deeply embedded in their roles, they avoided the vulnerabilities that larger conspiracies face: loose ends, divided loyalties, or inconsistencies in story. Their reach was amplified by their ability to trigger events indirectly, setting off chains that appeared entirely organic. The degree of foresight involved is perhaps the most unsettling part of the revelation. These individuals had prepared contingencies for multiple scenarios. If Watson refused to take a certain route, there was an alternate plan. If he confided in a friend, there were methods to undermine that trust. Even the possibility of law enforcement intervention had been accounted for, with distractions and diversions ready to draw attention away from the real sequence of events. It was this redundancy that allowed the plan to survive small deviations without collapsing. The longer the investigation team studied the reconstructed timeline, the more they realized how dangerously effective the approach had been. This was not brute force crime, nor was it simple deception. It was a form of narrative control, constructing a reality around the target so convincingly that any alternative explanation seemed irrational. Every clue that might have pointed to the truth was reframed within this narrative, ensuring that it appeared to support the false story rather than contradict it. Even in the final hours, Watson had no clear view of the trap closing around him. The last messages he sent were mundane, marked by the same blend of irritation and resignation that anyone might feel after a disrupted day. Yet between those ordinary lines now lies an unmissable tension, the subtle hesitation of someone sensing a threat they cannot fully articulate. What is most haunting is that this tension was exactly what his manipulators wanted, heightened enough to keep him responsive to their cues, but not so intense that he would break from the path they had laid. In the context of modern investigative thinking, the Watson case now stands as a demonstration of how deeply environment and perception can be shaped without overt force. The implications for criminal methodology are profound. It suggests that with enough planning, a target can be made to effectively participate in their own disappearance, believing each step to be self-directed. It also exposes the challenge for law enforcement: how to distinguish between natural chaos and chaos deliberately engineered to obscure a single calculated outcome. The meticulous nature of the operation also hints at long-term preparation extending far before the immediate days in question. Records now show that the key figures behind the case had been in Watson's orbit for years, not as close friends or constant presences, but as recurring background figures. Each interaction, no matter how trivial, may have served to gather data: his preferences, his reactions, his vulnerabilities. Over time, this slow accumulation of knowledge created a behavioral blueprint that allowed them to anticipate his decisions with uncanny accuracy. By removing any overt signs of hostility or confrontation, they ensured Watson never saw them as a threat. This long-game approach also meant they could embed themselves in the structures around him, positioning themselves to influence events indirectly. The resulting control was almost invisible, guiding him without the need for direct orders or obvious coercion. This is why the case was able to remain unsolved for so long. The official record was filled with fragments that, on their own, looked like the debris of ordinary life: rescheduled meetings, casual encounters, missed calls, and inconsequential delays. There was nothing in those fragments that screamed foul play, until modern tools allowed the patterns between them to emerge. Only then did the vast lattice of connections become visible, revealing the design that had been hidden in plain sight. The breakthrough changes not just the understanding of Watson's disappearance, but also the field of criminal investigation itself. It forces a recognition that some cases are not simply puzzles with missing pieces, but deliberate works of misdirection where every visible piece is part of the disguise. The skill lies not in assembling the pieces quickly, but in questioning whether the picture they form was ever meant to be real. And yet, for all the precision and control demonstrated by the architects of this mystery, the resolution hinged on something they could not fully anticipate: the relentless persistence of those willing to reopen the file, to question long-accepted narratives, and to apply fresh methods to old data. It is this persistence, rather than luck, that ultimately cracked the case. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the Gene Watson mystery? What shocking twist do you expect? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.